Welcome everyone to the panel AI for Safe Access to Water. This panel is part of the AI for Water track of the 2021 AI for Climate Global Forum. My name is Lucia Troches. I am the Global Forum Director, and it is a pleasure to be here with you in this incredible conversation. I would like to welcome our special guests, Nicolas St-Gelais, Rendani Mamphiswana, and Kate Turner, a group of experts that will discuss the role of AI systems to preserve one of our most precious resources, the water. I would like to tell you more about them. Nicolas always felt a strong connection to water and started a PhD in aquatic biology at the Université du Québec at Montreal to play a role in the protection of this critical resource. While completing his PhD, Nicolas participated in the Aqua Hacking, a Canadian hackathon to catalyze the development of technological solutions for water issues. He and his team won the competition, and shortly after, CANN Forecast was founded with the mission of developing smart tools to enable the proactive management of water by cities, leveraging AI and open data. Now, the IntelliSwim tool is used by more than 15 beaches, and the team is now working on providing water quality forecasts for drinking water, irrigation, and aquaculture. Now, moving forward to Rendani. Rendani Mamphiswana is head of the Research and Innovation Department at Nafasi Water. He is an innovation expert and policy researcher with over 12 years in industry, nonprofit, public policy, and academia. Rendani's international research contribution in the innovation and emerging technologies body of knowledge includes framework for managing technological innovation and the rise of machines in the workplace in emerging economies, new paradigms for commercializing for industrial revolution technologies, policy imperatives for Africa to realize and exploit opportunities in the fourth industrial revolution, and more. And last but not least, our interviewer and commentator for today's session, an ex-military engineering officer with a master's degree in materials engineering and a background in communications and electronic, Kate Turner served for 8 years in the Royal Air Force before deciding to divert her energy and passion towards global climate and biodiversity challenges. Kate is the founder and CEO of VOR, a startup strategy firm providing climate alignment for industry, writing bespoke climate strategies to bring industry into line with net zero and global environment goals, and providing climate vulnerability analysis for business and organizations. Kate, Nicolas, and Rendani, thank you for joining us today in this great conversation. Now, I would like to pass the microphone to Kate Turner, who will lead it. Kate, go ahead.
Thank you, Lucia. So I'm excited to introduce the first question that we have today to consider, which is, what is the scope of using AI and other frontier technologies to guarantee safe and equal access to clean water in a climate-changing world? First off, I'm gonna pass over to Rendani, and then we'll follow on in a very easy and organic style of conversation. So first off, Rendani, I'd love your thoughts.
Thank you very much. So when we look at the scope for artificial intelligence, as one of the intelligent technologies of the 4IR on the aspect of water, in areas such as ourselves in South Africa, where we see that there will be a deficiency of water in the next coming years. So as such, technologies such as AI are quite crucial to help us first and foremost to be able to predict the weather patterns and what the impact of those weather patterns are to the different sources of water. The other aspect as well from artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies has to do with how we redesign our systems to make sure that the right quality of water is delivered to the right uses, to make sure that water for agriculture is at the quality that agriculture needs, nothing more and nothing less. And I think designing a system in such a manner means that it is a lot more complex, and hence will require a different handling to be able to deal with that. I think there is such a scope from that perspective. And perhaps the other element, considering that aspects such as boreholes are going to become another area, especially considering the off-the-grid setup, then understanding what are the patterns to find the right amount of water and minimizing any sort of impact on the environment. I think building the machines that have the intelligence to improve their decision making in an effective manner will be quite important.
I totally agree, and it's the ability of using a statistical tool on steroids, which is kind of how I look at some of the machine learning technologies that we're talking about, to be able to play out simulations and work out second and third order effects of decisions can perhaps really help policymakers and deciding whether or not to push ahead with a decision or not, I suppose, and working out what those effects are going to be. Nicolas, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I can't agree more with what Rendani just mentioned, and I think we all agree that we are in a very interesting time, and AI is booming. I see that what is important to consider, and this is something we discovered working with AI into developing tools based on AI, is that AI is part of the solution, but we need also to consider the other very important aspects. So we are in a time with, as I was saying, AI is booming, is everywhere, but we have also access to open data, which is critical, or data to feed our AI algorithm. And this is something that is also emerging, but it's a challenge at the same time, because when we think about water quality data, it's really unequal. Some places there is a lot, some places there is less. So this is something that could be a challenge into developing this AI algorithm. But AI is there, and there's also IoT, or also all the different sensors that we're developing that we can get real-time data. That is also a gold mine for developing AI algorithm to inform on water. And as I was saying, with AI, with computing power, with IoT, with more and more open data, we are at a time, I think, where it's the time to use AI not only in fintech or in for recommendation on Netflix, but really the place on AI environment is something that will be increasing, and water is really somewhere where there's a lot of place for improvement. And as Rendani was mentioning, so there's place for nowcasting, so information on what's the water quality right now for cities, for government, for the population as well. There's also the place for forecasting, as we do for a weather forecast, but I dream about a water quality forecast that can be accessed to be proactive. So there's so much potential, even if we think at climate change, right? Using AI and forecasting approaches to just forecast based on different climatic scenario, what would be and we were talking about drought are something that are affecting everywhere in the world. So this is something that we can definitely use AI to solve this problem, and put, as I was saying, data, AI, computing power together to solve these important problems. And we are at a crossroad, I think, and we'll see a big augmentation in the next few years.
And Rendani, do you think, with your extensive background in policy, particularly, that tools like machine learning or AI, if you'd like, are going to be useful to understand an appropriate allocation of water between sectors like industry, sanitation, and agriculture, where there's likely to become an even more fine balance, particularly in Africa, and perhaps around regions of the Middle East as well, in Central Asia? And how open are policymakers at the moment to these technologies, and perhaps to the indications that come out of the statistical analysis?
Yeah, so I think in terms of understanding the interfaces between different sectors, and in view of you are dealing with a very complex system at a national level. Understanding the different impacts when certain things change, which you are not able to achieve that on your own. And I think the value of advanced and intelligent technologies such as AI is in modeling the different systems and being able to run different scenarios. So as it stands most of these technologies have been utilized, at an engineering level. What we do have is the possibility that certain policy options could potentially be tested at a system level to have some understanding of the robustness of what we're putting forward. And perhaps, a big aspect in the policy space, really, when you deal with complex systems, is unintended consequences. And I think having the right data and modeling the data correctly, of course, it doesn't give you a real life setup. However, what you do have, you are able to run different scenarios and do stress testing and scenario analysis that help improve whether or not a decision that is being taken will achieve the intended objectives. And I think what it does, so instead of waiting to get into the field and do the actual test of a particular policy option, one has the possibility of testing that on the screen and have some ideas on how to be able to take that forward. So there is definitely that option. In terms of are we there yet from policymakers' perspective for them to appreciate the value of the technologies? I think there's still a lot of trust issues around the technology, and also there's also an element of conversant. How are the policymakers conversant with the different technologies? And I think that's a professional education view that has to be brought forward, and perhaps start with certain pilots in a smaller scale to show what some of the benefits are, and how cost effective it could be to run some of the scenarios in a machine rather than taking it into the field where the consequences could be larger, or even from a cost allocation and usage point of view. So there is that possibility, and I think we must start at a smaller scale and then connect the systems up. I think what we must not do is try to build a national system as a whole. What we must do is to start at the bottom and start connecting the different pieces as we move along.
I agree. I think that's a sensible approach, the kind of the slowly approach, particularly with policymakers to gain trust. Nicolas, do you have any final thoughts on this one before we perhaps move on to another question, or indeed any other parts of the question which were including other frontier technologies as well, open to both?
Yeah. Again, I agree so much with what Rendani was saying, and I think something I want to add here is a bit in the line of what Rendani was saying. I think we all have a responsibility because there's some education to do about AI, because too often we see different perspectives. For example, there's some people when you talk about the AI, they have the impression that it's going to solve everything, which is not the case. And you have the other side of a spectrum where people are really careful and they think that it's hype, but with no real application. And it's somewhere in the middle. So I think we really have a mission, or we need to be careful about saying about what it can really do, because I'm sure it can help. And I was as you mentioned, we are at a time when working with cities as we do. Cities have tons of data, and as Rendani mentioned, there's an opportunity to put all these data together in an intelligent system to really help making better decisions, so bringing insight. But we need to start with small projects, like grassroots, go places by places, because we don't want to start with too large, because there's a challenge. And again, as you were saying, we need to evaluate what's the cost. For us, we're working, for example, in public health, is it really safer than what you're using right now? So we need to go step by step and educate people about what AI can do for water and what it cannot do, I would say. But it's a world of possibilities.
No, and I think just to add on the point that Nicolas has indicated, from a technology selection point of view, AI must go through the same rigor, where it must be selected for the opportunities, not a whole technology to deploy in every scenario. So when we approach a particular opportunity or a problem, part of the assessment once the problem has been identified should be technology options. And it might happen that artificial intelligence was not the technology that gets selected. And I think that rigor, even from an engineering point of view, is quite important, that we mustn't just choose the technology that everyone is talking about, but sound engineering, sound fundamentals and selections are really important. Otherwise, we end up adopting AI in instances where another technology could have been a lot more effective and have a longer term impact. So those fundamentals of technology development and selections are quite important and must not be left outside just because of the excitement around artificial intelligence.
Most definitely. Remembering that AI in itself is not the ends, and it's the means, it's a tool to help us figure out problems, which leads me well onto the next question. How can we leverage AI to prevent, halt and reverse inequalities in water access powered by climate change? Over to you first, Nicolas.
Yeah, so this is a big challenge, and Rendani mentioned a bit like a drought problem, and we have similar problem in Canada where we have especially like First Nation communities where don't have access to safe water. So this is a very important issue, and I tend to be a very positive person, and I think there's a lot of potential. But and I think like we need to identify what are the big threats that are posed by climate change and identify where AI can play a role to diminish these inequalities. And I think that Rendani mentioned before a bit the droughts, and this is definitely somewhere where there's a big question mark right now. So where in different climate scenario, when we're going to get a drought, how often? And I think like we can really use AI to better forecast when droughts are coming. It's not solving the problem. Like we need to solve climate change, and this is a whole other issue. But I really think that AI can be used to just better forecast, get alerts of when we may get these droughts for in terms of water quantity. There's also like things that we can do with water quality, because we see all around the world, there's a lot of inequality based on water quality problems. One example would be blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, and they are more and more common because of climate change, because the water is warming, and these bacteria are producing toxins. So it's really a big problem for water supply, recreation, cattle, irrigation. But now there is some very nice initiative. I think it's in the US, using like satellite images to detect cyanobacter bloom, and it can be done on a global scale as a warning system to see, okay, now we may have water quality problem. And again, I think it's always a matter of combining different technologies. So we're advancing in satellite images and in AI, and it can be put together to detect before water quality problem in different bodies of water and work on these inequalities. Again, an aspect that AI can help. Yeah.
Wonderful. Rendani, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, the impact of climate change on the water bodies is quite huge. And I think the starting point is really understanding that data, and I think further understanding the pace at which there is a degradation of the water quality versus also, the reduction in the amount of water. So I think that has to be the starting point, so that we actually understand what kind of problem are we dealing with, what has been, which areas are affected most, and, what exactly is impacting, which aspect of climate change is impacting them. And I think with the broader climate change risk mitigation, climate change adaptation approaches, then we design responses that are suitable for each context, because different places are affected differently. As Nicolas has said, some areas is the aspect of, there isn't enough water. Some places have enough water, but it's not drinkable it's not at so from a health point of view, it's not the right quality. And I think building those different data sets and understanding, what is the patterns of data, and coming to some sorts of causalities, and then embedding these as part of the broader climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation as well. And I think it's important that when we're talking about water and climate change, that it cannot be handled as a separate aspect. And we spoke previously about this on policies and the integrated nature of the different sectors, looked at from that broader perspective as well.
Absolutely. Not treating stuff in isolation, but also making sure we drill down to find out the extent of the inequalities that we're dealing with, so that we can appropriately kind of use tools like AI. I agree. Do either of you have any other thoughts on this question before we move on to the next?
Yeah, maybe just quickly, something that Rendani mentioned on, I think, like inequalities, and mentioned data. I think I talked a bit about it earlier, but there's a lot of inequalities in data as well. Like it's not, and as I was saying, like data can limit where we can apply. There's some very nice initiative like GEMSTAT by the UN when they collect data on water quality all around the world. But this is something that we need to be conscious about where is the data and the open data that would be accessed, because it's really not equal all over the map. And I think that going back also to the idea of education is that by talking more about these predictive models, could be machine learning or AI, or could be other approaches, I think it's also an incentive to collect more data, because we see what we can get out of this data. It's just not collecting data for collecting data, but there is an added value to this data. And I think it's something that is turning. So it's just something I wanted to add, that we need more data, and it's something that is turning. Yeah, we need to educate and then see what we can do with this data, I would add.
Agree. Wonderful. Well, we'll move on to the next question, which is, what financing mechanisms can further advance safe access to quality water through the use of frontier technologies? So it can be AI, but it can be any other technologies that you'd like to introduce as well. We'll hand over first to Rendani.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this financing question, and I happen to have been on lots of conversations today at work around financing innovation, and I think from a fundamentals point of view, when we talk about finance, and likely there will be quite a few accountants around us. When you talk about financing, you talk about a return on the investment. And I think when it comes to societal and environmental projects, how we approach that, applying different models or different thinking, and not only looking at the return from the actual return on the money point of view, becomes quite important. And I think an approach on how financing can be done in terms of water, has to do with what is the societal impact, if the right quality of water is not placed for access to our people. What is the societal cost that we experience if people are not having access to water? And I think that broader calculation of the impact of not having water, ultimately on healthcare spending, ultimately on other aspects that governments across the world tend to provide. And I think understanding it from that perspective, I think, I've not done the numbers myself, I think for the places that need the water in the rural areas where people might not be able to afford, I think there is a case for us to be able to see that actually by providing water, we actually save so much, from the state budget, if one is to put it like that. So I think that broad thinking on not just looking at it from the return of the funds put on the table, but we must look at what is the cost of not providing water to a section of society. And I think it is that cost, that we must say, but as a society, we actually don't want to pay that cost if it actually means that it can be prevented. Because the reality is I grew up in the rural side of South Africa in the north. Having access to certain things at an earlier age means that I could be channeled, I could be on a pathway, where later on I bring a return back to the government from a tax point of view. And I think having that long-term view of, enabling the thriving of young people and giving them the opportunities could later have a return for the state. So I think that broad thinking is quite important. We cannot, for things like this, look at it from the traditional financing models, and this is where our social scientists, are very, very important. This conversation of financing for social good cannot, unfortunately, be left to the financiers and the lawyers alone. There's a need to look at it from a social impact point of view on the kind of society that we are trying to build. It's the same way even on technologies. How do we make sure that certain technologies are available to parts of society that if they were to pay for it, they couldn't afford it? But if we make them available now, 10 years later, they are able to pay for it, and they are even able to produce other technologies. And I think that broad view, it's very, very important. I think as we, as the millennials have showed us, in terms of this, social, aspect, being concerned about, equality, being concerned about, inclusiveness, I think such a thinking must be transferred even to how we look at, financing of innovation, especially from a social good perspective. There's a need for a paradigm shift. The norm of financing is just not going to work, or else, the poor are going to continue being the poor. So I think that shift is quite an important one to bring into the table.
I agree. Nicolas, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree so much with this. And I think initially, often we think about water about a local problem, but more and more with climate change, with water issue, it's becoming a global issue, right? So we need about financing mechanisms that are global, but we all know it's the challenges, right? Because there's growing inequalities. And I'm always thinking about the COVAX example, something that was supposed to be global, but it's always challenging to find a way to finance these things at larger scale. So honestly, financing is really something challenging that we need to tackle, because we're all responsible for issues that are happening all around the world. But I think that grassroots initiatives are very important, small initiative. And from my perspective, I'm not an expert on this, but from a startup perspective, there's so many startups that have some very interesting solution to provide. And again, we need to make sure that it's just some way works, some way won't. But I really see a shift in the past 2 or 3 years. First, we can talk about grants, or even from investors. Now, profit is not only the thing that we're talking about, but SDGs have more and more weight to them. And there is some investors that focus on companies that are trying to solve SDGs. Same thing for grants. There are more and more grants that you need to solve some larger problem. And this is a way, when we do, again, it's going to take time, but this is a way to ease financing for companies that are available or viable, or solutions that are viable, as was mentioned by Rendani, that have a positive impact. And but there is, I can really see this shift. And this is something that would be very important and we also need more and more to track not only our impact on money, but also a societal impact, environmental impact. So this is something that I really see as a positive way of moving into financing and getting this innovative solution that are coming from everywhere in the world and to becoming something that are applied. And I really see that as something that is becoming more and more important and something that would change the way we do things.
Rendani, have you got any comeback points on that?
No, nothing, and nothing else. It's just a very sobering conversation on finance, and I think we still have a long way to go on it. So yeah.
I definitely agree. I think we all know that money inevitably does make the world go round. So it's a really important conversation, but an irritatingly challenging one as well. I'm sure you feel that more than most, being in the policy world too. We'll move on to the last question, which I'm biased, but I think is probably the most interesting and exciting question. But what is the scope of using AI technologies to inform policy mechanisms to foster future-ready societies facing a potential water crisis? I'll hand over first to you, Rendani, and then we'll go over to Nicolas.
So, I mean, on the aspect of policy mechanisms, as I've indicated earlier on, there is definitely the opportunity to test out policy options on the screen, as much as there are limitations on the models and the algorithms that we are able to put forward. There is definitely an opportunity. So I'm finalizing my doctorate on the national systems of innovation, looking at South Africa as a case study. And as part of the study, in terms of designing the system, monitoring the particular system to make sure that it's reaching certain maturity levels, and using that understanding to balancing the resourcing so that you don't overinvest in the system when it has reached a certain performance level. What I found in the study is that advanced technologies such as AI and others could be quite useful on that front. What we currently see, and not particularly a water aspect, but the things such as innovation surveys tend to happen after a very long time. By the time the data is available, it's quite a few years into it. And I think, how useful is such an innovation survey, it's very debatable. Because, if a survey was done 2-3 years ago, that information doesn't help the policymaker to do anything. By the time the data is available, things have changed quite dramatically at that particular time. And I think, obviously, there are data breaches, information, and data security issues. But considering that, quite a lot of the information, even from a business point of view, is being captured in some way, there's definitely an opportunity of using the available data to somehow use that to come very close to real time in understanding, our different systems, and at a sectoral level, water being at a sector level, and that data close to real time certainly improves decision making, similar to a driver of an automobile, who has a view of what's happening around him or her. You are better off making the decision than someone who's finding out that something else has happened a lot later on. So there's definitely that opportunity to reduce the time lag between when the data was taken and when the decision has to be made. And I think there could be quite a lot of cost And I think also the other aspect is the analysis of the data. Perhaps, someone like me who understands, innovation to a certain extent, I don't need to wait for the final report. When the raw data is available, certain people must have access to the raw data and they can start doing stuff with the raw data rather than having to wait for somebody else to make a report and have it available later on. And as we go along, some of these reports and visualizations could be made available a lot more quickly. I mean, I spend a lot of my time from the engineering side, where you are in an operating facility. You've got a screen, that shows you what's happening in the operating facility. And I can almost argue that, with the national data and, bringing it forward correctly, policymakers can move into a space, where they almost see how things are moving a lot closer to themselves and not having to wait to see the impact of their decisions. So that possibility is there. And I think we must just, as Nicolas indicated earlier on, the important thing is to pilot these things, at a smaller scale, so that we understand the nuances. The reality is there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of things that we don't understand. So testing first on the screen and at a smaller scale gives us the opportunity to understand what is causing what, up to a sufficient level. So that opportunity is certainly there, but it mustn't be applied haphazardly. And perhaps, I know the conversation here is around artificial intelligence. I think a broad understanding of how the different suite of technologies come in to help us understand these different realities is quite important. And I say this as well because the paradigm shift of the fourth industrial revolution is convergence. It's not about a single technology. It's about how a combination of technologies come together to make certain impact. And understanding the impact when they come together is really what we need to be striving for. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicolas, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think AI can play a very big role in informing policy for just to be ready for the water crisis that are upcoming. And one challenge that we face on a personal level often, or one obstacle, is that we need policymaker to focus on the long term, which we all know is often a challenge, right? It's like for my example, when we work mainly with cities, often cities want to nowcast. They want to know, okay, what's my water quality right now? How much water I have right now? But when we talk about longer term goal, it's always challenging. But this is something that, again, it takes time, but I think we all getting more and more, we know more and more that we need to think about the longer term, and it's something that's coming. But this is, I see, is the first challenge. But there's so much potential of using AI just to inform better, as Rendani was saying. And one example that I could give, there was a study that I worked on when I was doing my PhD. We're looking at many thousands of lakes, and what we see is that, and what we saw, and it's in many papers as well, is that the worst thing you can do to affect your water quality is remove forest, right? So when you start removing forest, then it starts to decrease your water quality. Then depending if you replace by urban development of agriculture is going to affect different services. But and this is really where the power is. So we can model different decision with AI and say, okay, if I develop here, what's going to happen? And there's very interesting project in the US. There's Invest, for example, where you can see the impact of different decision on different water services provided by water. So this is all the potential. And then even with climate change, we can even factor in climate change on different climate change scenarios and see, okay, if I cut the forest here, what would be the impact on this water supply? Or if I cut the forest here. So again, there's so much possibilities that we can, or specific question that we can tackle with AI. Again, I think the message also, we need to be careful. We cannot take the answer we would get from one model, because all models are wrong, right? So we just also, again, need to be careful that even if AI model says something, we need to be critical about it and change with time. But having some information is better than no information. So we need to work on these, just trying to forecast and push a different thing. And as Rendani was saying, like, put different technologies together, gathering real-time data, gather long-time data, putting things together and inform policymakers. There's so much potential, but we need to work on a technical point to get there, and also to improve our algorithm with time to make better predictions, but also to convince policymakers that we also need to think on the longer term. It's not just the next day or the next week, which is definitely a challenge, I would say.
For sure. And I think one of the other challenges that perhaps we can consider is how water scarcity is going to lead to increased tensions interstate and internationally. So globally, around 2/3 of the world's fresh water comes from rivers and lakes that cross national borders. And increased water scarcity exacerbated by climate change is likely to increase the occurrence of conflicts for the foreseeable future. We've seen that restricted water flows lead to intrastate conflicts, where each side ends up accusing each other of exceeding water quotas. I wonder also that in turn leads to the proliferation of armed intertribal clashes over access to water. How, I wonder, other than just simulating perhaps what's likely to happen using technology like AI, how else can other frontier technologies help us stumble into this problem? Do you think? I'll open that question to both.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting one, and I think we face it in South Africa as well. We get quite a bit of our water from Lesotho, even though it's in South Africa. But yeah, there's quite a lot of water that we get from that side. So I don't think this is a technological problem. I think what we have here, it's a trade issue, right? You're making use of water that is available from my land on your other side of the land. The question then is, how do we make sure that there's equitable trade in that arrangement? And I think that's the bigger issue that we need to be able to handle, that there is fairness across such a trade, similar to how other commodities from the natural land are also transferred to other parts of the world. I know that space also has a great deal of unfairness, especially considering the history of colonialism in many parts of Africa. But I think going forward, looking at water flows from the perspective of trade, to say, I give you water, you give me what? And I think finding those alignments, just like any other, form of commercial agreement, is quite important. I don't think I'm not seeing it from where I'm standing, as much more of a technological issue. And I think when there's unfairness, the other party is always going to fight back or try to cause problems. And I think this is where any form of bullying by a superior state, must be managed. Otherwise we really create problem for the future generation. Because if one generation feels that there was unfairness at a later stage, they might just close, and such an immediate closure will definitely result in a form of war or any other form of conflict. So I think the trade aspect is important. And I think that's where we must spend our time on to resolve that. Because of the jurisdiction, that if something is in my land, it's mine. If you want to make use of it, you must give me something else, whether it is in your land or you pay for it. Those are the aspects. So this is an international trade issue. that needs to be handled as such from where I'm standing. Maybe Nicolas has got other bright technological ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I may add, I think you're totally right. There's so much other aspects of this question that are not technological. One quick thing that I will add is one thing that we can make sure, though, in respect, because it's such a complex question, and it's at the same time, that's always also a responsibility, I think, is that our AI algorithm that we're developing, we need to make sure that they're not biased. Like there is example, because there is biases and they can be learned by model. For example, in insurance, anyway, we just need to make sure that the algorithm we're developing are responsible. They're not unbiased, which is often we don't think it's a big challenge, but it can be a big challenge to not replicate the bias that are existing in our model. And one resource I would point out to this, I don't know if you read about it, but there was the Declaration of Montreal on responsible AI. And I think they have 11 principles or something like that. And it's a very good starting point for us, everyone working with us, read the declaration. It's just, how can we make sure that AI do not replicate all the inequalities that there is everywhere or make them worse? So I think from the technical standpoint, I think this is something we can make sure that we're not biased or not that biased with our models. But yeah, there's other aspect. And again, it's, as Rendani was, it's not just a technological question, and we need to put everyone at the table, which is the challenge. But and have discussion. But yeah, this is what I would add.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah,
so, I thought maybe I add on the aspect of the bias, and I want to go back again on the issue of technology selection, but this time talk about design. So in any form of a design of a system or a technology, it has to go through certain reviews, certain rigor, certain checks. The same applies to softwares, to AI and other technologies as well. And as much as some of the software development approaches allows for agility, but agile approaches to speed up certain things, from a program management perspective, must not be the excuse not to do the checks and balances. And I think, these declarations that Nicolas has mentioned are quite important. But fundamentally, I remember this when I finished my undergrad in chemical engineering in 2008. One of the modules that we did was ethics. Ethics as an engineer. As an engineer, you have an ethical obligation to make sure that what you're designing serves the purpose that you are intending to design for. And this issue of biases are actually ethical issues on the part of our engineers who are sitting behind this algorithm. And I think that's an important part that has to be re-elevated into the engineering work, because it is an engineering work that is taking place and getting a product ready for deployment. A product must get ready for deployment when it has been signed off that is ready for deployment. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you both. Absolutely. Remembering that AI as a tool is wonderful and there's incredible possibilities out there, but that it is fallible and we should consider it just one tool in our tool set. But also that remembering that policy change done by humans at the moment is the actual underpinning of action and not just having a go at the technologies. At this point, Nicolas, Rendani, I'm going to close and hand back over to Lucia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We feel so honored to have been a part of this interesting conversation. From topics, starting from topics like the effectiveness of the AI solutions towards the protection of this amazing resource, to the excitement around it, right? Because we know that AI is just like a very hot topic right now, knowing that this must not be the answer, but a tool to leverage, right? And to other things like the financial innovation that has to answer different questions of like what costs are we willing to pay to protect this resource, enabling opportunities for different parts of the communities that are involved on the protection of this resource as well. And also to the reducement of the difference between when the data is taken to when the actions are made, how the public policy is involved in all of this process, and just making sure that the long-term goals are accurate, taking into consideration, like this last part of the conversation, right? That it has to be an ethical consideration to use this technology. So it was really great learning from all of your experiences and learning more about this important topic. Thank you so much for joining us during this global forum. And to those watching, stay tuned for our next presentation on the AI for Water track. See you soon.